We have Jamie Raskin in there accusing us of worshiping Trump, worshiping as a convicted felon.
He is a convicted felon.
Well, yeah, so is George Floyd. There were riots burning down the fucking country over George Floyd.
In the aftermath of Donald Trump's criminal conviction, Marjorie Taylor Greene continues to publicly spiral. She's throwing F-bombs at reporters, she's ranting about her fellow Republicans, and she's derailing congressional hearings when Democrats troll her with the fact that she's part of a cult that worships Trump. And despite all of this, Republican Speaker Mike Johnson appears to be flirting with her renewed calls to impeach President Biden in political retribution. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bell before you go. All right, friends, we have a couple of clips to look at in this video, but we talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene a lot in this channel for a few reasons. Number one, it's fun to make fun of her. Number two, she is emblematic of the GOP. She's not an outlier. She is a state, she represents state power. She's a sitting member of Congress. And as best I can tell, she's the future of the GOP. She's one of their best fundraisers, one of their most vocal and public members. She's devoutly loyal to Donald Trump. And yeah, she's emblematic of its descent into a cult of personality. But when she's confronted with the fact and trolled with the fact that she worships Donald Trump, she's really triggered by it. And so we have a couple of clips to play on this score, and then we'll unpack it together.
Her words be taken down, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a point of order.
Mr. Griffin
they
is
accused us
Mr.
of
Griffin is
worshiping President Trump. We don't worship President Trump.
Gentlelady will suspend.
So as you can tell, she's getting increasingly irritated. We don't worship Donald Trump. We don't. It's not a cult. Well, before again I play her response, this is what Congressman Jamie Raskin said during that same hearing, which triggered what you just saw from Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then triggered an even bigger, more unhinged response in the aftermath.
Yes, I have.
Well, Dr. Fauci, I want to join my colleague from Florida in apologizing to you that some of our colleagues in the United States House of Representatives seem to want to drag your name through the mud. They're treating you, Dr. Fauci, like a convicted felon. Actually, you probably wish they were treating you like a convicted felon. They treat convicted felons with love and admiration. Some of them blindly worship convicted felons.
Damn. All right. Jamie Raskin giving off the heat. That's what triggered Marjorie Taylor Greene's response. And again, if you thought, okay, well, as far as Marge is concerned, that's relatively tame. Well, a reporter caught up with her in the halls of Congress after that hearing, and her response here is considerably more drastic.
In that room?
No, absolutely not. I mean, everything I said is correct. It's how the American people feel. It's what we know to be a fact. It's all the evidence has been proven true. We have Jamie Raskin in there accusing us of worshiping Trump, worshiping as a convicted felon.
He is a convicted felon.
Well, yeah, so is George Floyd. And everybody, and you all too, the media worship George Floyd. Democrats worship George Floyd. There were riots burning down the fucking country over George Floyd, and Raskin is in there saying we worship him. Excuse me, let me correct you, and this is really important. I don't worship, I worship God. God. And Jesus is my savior. I don't worship President Trump. And I'm really sick and tired of the bullshit annex I have to deal with constantly from the Democrats.
So funny to hear Marjorie Taylor Greene whine about antics. I mean, this is a person who all she has attempted to do since President Biden has been elected is impeach him. That's it. She has no major policy initiatives. She tries to relitigate debunked conspiracy theories, like the idea that the 2020 election was stolen when in fact it wasn't. She constantly abuses state power. She doesn't apply it meaningfully to represent her constituents, her party, or anything. It's just her own selfish, cultish desires. And she's upset that Democrats troll her for the idiot that she is. Sorry, Snowflake. This is the environment you helped create. And the fact that Democrats are finally giving you just a taste of your own medicine, that's on you. Maybe if you were a more productive member of Congress, maybe if you and your caucus were more productive, that this iteration of Congress wouldn't be the least productive since the Great Depression and on track to be the least productive since the Civil War. That is entirely the fault of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, speaking of productive or unproductive Republicans, Marjorie Taylor Greene also took shots at her fellow Republicans. Actually, one thing I do want to say here. This is important too. I almost let it slip. George Floyd, who was murdered by Derek Chauvin, who was convicted for his crimes. He knelt on George Floyd's neck, and it was one of the most important catalysts of the 2020 protests, okay? And which, by the way, was a broader protest against systemic racism in this country. Now, that's a false equivalence that she created. She's like, well, George Floyd was a convicted felon, and you all burned down half the effing country. Number one, that didn't happen. The vast majority of the George Floyd protests, the single biggest mass protest movement in American history, millions upon millions upon millions of people in all 50 states, not organized, not cohered. It was just a mass series of protests all across this country. The vast majority of them were peaceful. And half the country wasn't burned. A quarter of the country wasn't burned. Nothing like that. Number one. Number two, George Floyd was murdered. Democrats, liberals, and progressives weren't protesting George Floyd's criminal record, right? We weren't saying, he's a felon and he should not be a felon. That wasn't what the protests were about. The protests were about the fact that he was murdered. Donald Trump has not been murdered and shouldn't be murdered, right? These situations are apples and oranges. She thinks Republican response and outrage to Trump's conviction is at the very least comparable or justified to the mass protests about George Floyd's murder. It's because she's really stupid, right? She just hears convicted felon and tries to draw an equivalence. But MAGA only traffics in false equivalence. Really stupid stuff from Marjorie Taylor Greene. But wait, there's more. Because she goes off on a series, again, on rants on Steve Bannon's War Room podcast. And she says, actually, what we need to be doing now is, again, trying to impeach President Biden. And the fact that we're not doing it is proof of Republican fecklessness.
We should be doing right now, today, we should be voting to impeach Joe Biden because of the invasion in the United States. Oh, but no, none of that is happening up here in Washington, D.C., because Republicans continually have their head up their ass and can't figure out how to actually use the power that the people gave us. This is a new time in America, and I am so fed up, Steve. I am so fed up. I am so sick of it because I know people at home are sick of it. People are sick and tired of a feckless, useless Republican Party that never does a damn thing to stop any of this.
So people are fed up with the Republican Party. Poll after poll after poll shows it, but they're not fed up that you're not impeaching President Biden. The polls have never supported impeaching the president. People are upset that you're not being productive, that you're not working with Democrats to pass bipartisan legislation that would address at least some of their needs, that you expect to be the tail that wags the dog and you try to impose your far-right unpopular agenda on the majority of government. That's what they're upset about, that you try to do that instead of using what little power you have, but important power, nonetheless, to actually produce results for the American people. So she's still quite a bit off the mark. But it's always fun to hear her go after Republicans, so I can't say that those clips weren't entirely enjoyable. But the other interesting thing is the response from Republican Speaker Mike Johnson, whom, as you can tell, Marjorie Taylor Greene does not like, right? She repeatedly threatened and even attempted to have him removed from the speakership. You know, he actually seems to be flirting with the notion that her renewed calls to impeach President Biden are something worth pursuing.
Marjorie Taylor Greene has said that she's going to trigger a privileged resolution to impeach President Biden this week if you don't move on that. Have you had any discussions on that yet? And is that something you'd be open to doing about it now?
We haven't talked about it. I mean, in general, the impeachment power is one that we wield very carefully here, as I've said so many times. Next to the declaration of war, it's the heaviest power that Congress has. It needs to be very methodical. Look, there's no question. President Biden, I think, is the worst president. I think President Biden is the worst president in the history of the country. And there may well be impeachable offenses. There's an investigation process that's gone about.
So there you go. So Mike Johnson, of course, he gives his opinion about President Biden. It's hilarious because he's a devout sycophant of the actual worst president in recorded history. As a matter of fact, a plurality of American political scientists and political historians have come to the conclusion that Donald Trump is the worst president in history. We also know he's considerably less effective than President Biden was. I digress. He's entitled to his hyper-partisan, unsubstantiated opinions. But again, he didn't shut it down. He didn't say, listen, that's ridiculous. That's absurd. We're not going to do that. He seems to be flirting with the idea, which makes sense, right? Because there is a lot of MAGA is quite upset with Mike Johnson because they regard him as being insufficiently loyal to Trump, right? Because he didn't shut down the government, because he's not trying to defund the government, because he recognizes the congressional math for what it is, that he has a 1-seat majority and he can't impose his will on President Biden or the rest of Congress, that he doesn't have that kind of power. Johnson's reasonable in that respect, or at least more reasonable than Marjorie Taylor Greene, who wants to use what this divided, fractious, slim majority, which is ever shrinking, to somehow, again, impose his will on the rest of government. Johnson recognizes that that's not possible. And so a lot of MAGA is upset with him. So it makes sense from, again, just a purely cynical political perspective that he would leave the door open, that we would flirt with this. Well, I think Biden sucks, and maybe there are impeachable offenses and there are investigations that are ongoing. But it's also incredibly dangerous. At the same time, it's also a political year. It's an election year. And previously, unsuccessful impeachments have only aided the political prospects of the target. It happened with Donald Trump once during his first impeachment. It happened with President Clinton as well. So that's another thing that Mike Johnson might be considering, like, damn, as we get closer to the election, is this more of a risk or reward to keep the impeachment option open for President Biden? But I just don't think it bodes well that Marjorie Taylor Greene's frantic, rabid demands for Biden's impeachment as political retribution is something that the current Speaker of the House is at least openly flirting with. But that just goes to show, at the end of the day, the GOP is not a serious governing party. They are an authoritarian cult of personality. And the only thing they are truly concerned about is pleasing Donald Trump. And that's really gross. Let me know what you think in the comments.